Become a Prime member today by visiting iloveblackpeople.com and receive our free I Love Black People t-shirt, Black Survival Guide, and become a part of our I Love Black People network, which comes with a global safety toolkit, nomad health insurance, Pan-African certification classes, and so much more. Go to iloveblackpeople.com now.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to I Love Black People, where we fearlessly discuss and navigate issues relevant to Black people. I'm your co-host, Sinclair Skinner, co-founder of iloveblackpeople.com. My co-host today is Dr. Tyreen Wright, scholar, author, and activist. Today we're discussing controversial U.S. elections. Dr. Wright, where would you like to start?
Thank you, Sinclair. I think we probably should start somewhere in the 19th century with one of the biggest compromises around an election, which was the election of 1877. And it was a dispute that took place in 1876 between two candidates, Democratic candidate Samuel Tilden and Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes. And essentially what happened is that there was an inconclusive election. Let me say it clearly, an inconclusive election. And in exchange for the federal troops being withdrawn from the South, they would grant Hayes the win. But this is the thing. At the time, we have to go back to radical Reconstruction. Okay? And radical Reconstruction was what was going on in the South at that time as a result of the Civil War. So the troops, Northern troops, the Union Army was stationed in the South. And this is a funny and an important historical caveat, which is this. All the United States is not treated equally when we talk about this period in history and the Civil War. So this is the trick question. What part, or has the United States ever been invaded? The answer for the North is no. But for the Southern states, the answer to that same question is yes. Why? Because the Northern Union Army invaded the South and fought the war in the Southern states, which meant once the war was over, those troops also stayed in the South and basically were an occupying force. So this election would actually determine whether or not troops would stay in the South or not. And so since this deal is cut as a result of this election or this controversial election or this debacle, you had a deal cut, and Hayes, who would be president, would withdraw the federal troops from Louisiana and South Carolina. And it would actually mark the end of radical Reconstruction. And
what time is that? What time period is that?
So this is the election of 1876, 1877. And it is the end of radical Reconstruction. So after the Civil War ends in 1865, you have this period of about 12 years that radical Reconstruction is implemented by the Republican Party. And that is the period through which we get the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments to the Constitution. And when this election comes up, part of what happens, because it is not conclusive, the Republicans and the Democrats cut this deal, say, okay, you want something, we want something. They allow Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes to take the win and Tilden to take the loss. But in exchange for this, the troops would be withdrawn from the southern states that they were occupying. So the U.S. military was still occupying the South, okay, in terms of a military force. The same way when you think about foreign countries in wars, right? The Navy brings the Marines do the fighting, and then the Army is the occupying force post the war. Well, the U.S. Army was occupying the South because they had invaded the South, and the Civil War was fought in the South, not in the North. Okay. So that being said, when this election comes up and it's inconclusive, there's a deal cut between the two. They allow Hayes to take the presidency in exchange for withdrawal of the troops in the South. And we could go a little further, but there's a lot of things that end up getting reversed as a result of this particular scenario, right? And an election debacle. And of course, we might have mentioned it before, but of course, the whole 40 acres and a mule and the field order 15 with Sherman that promised 40 acres and a mule to newly freemen in the United States, those things would actually get reversed quite quickly under President Johnson as well. So, there's a couple of caveats in there, but that's the gist of
So the part you were mentioning about the 40 acres and a mule, how does that contextually relate to the issues that happened with the particular election or prior to that election? Can you set that up in context?
Yeah, sure. That's an interesting story because what happened is General Sherman, who was a general in the Civil War, and funny enough, he was really a Southerner who ends up fighting on the northern side for the Union Army. He's originally, I believe, from somewhere like Virginia. Point being is he ends up doing a march through Georgia. Okay. And if if you're a history buff, you could look this up, but there's a story about Sherman making Georgia howl. Okay. Or Sherman's march to the sea. Sherman had an army that was 50 miles wide and 50 miles long, essentially a moving city. And because of the rhetoric attached to the Civil War by Southerners, Sherman promised that he would bring the war to the Southerners and demoralize them because he felt like this was the only way to end this war for once, pretty much like ripping the Band-Aid off really quick. He wanted them to understand you guys are always talking about war. You fired the first shot on Fort Sumter. And we want you to understand that war is ugly. You should never ask for it. And so he marches his army through Georgia, and he does something that today is basically seen as taboo in terms of war. Right? You're not supposed to bring the war so soldiers should not war or target civilians. Those are rules of engagement in war. But what Sherman
war crimes, those would be war crimes.
Right, it would be. So, but he implemented what would be considered a scorched earth policy and an attempt to demoralize the Southern citizens in Georgia specifically and other parts of the South, specifically because he wanted to make them understand this war that you asked for, you shouldn't have asked for it. And I'm going to bring it to you, and it should be hard and swift. And so his moving city is moving through the South and feeding off of the land and the population. So when they go into a city, they are consuming it. They're eating the crops. They're eating, whatever livestock that's there that's they can consume. They are a moving city. And with that, what they leave in their path is just mayhem because they are burning everything as they move along, consuming whatever is consumable and whatever is not, and whatever is left behind them, they would set it on fire.
Okay, so how does that get to the 40 acres?
Well, what happens is that there is a group or a large camp following of Africans who had been freed under the Contraband Act. And what that meant was that the people who ran from Southern plantations to Union lines, Union camps in the South, were neither free or enslaved, right? They would fall under contraband. That being said, you had camp followers, so they would follow the Union Army moving around. Sherman wanted to get rid of them because strategically this was a problem. It let the Confederates know where they were because they had this tail, right? They had people trailing them. So on one occasion, when Sherman crosses a footbridge and his army crosses a footbridge somewhere outside of Savannah, once they get to the other side, they knew Confederate soldiers were following them. They cut the footbridge, and all those African people who had been formerly enslaved that were following their army would actually get massacred by the Confederate army. Wow. And Sherman caused that, and he understands that he caused that. So what happens shortly after that is that when he arrives in Savannah, he calls a meeting amongst Black leadership in Savannah, because there were freed persons already in Savannah, or people who lived free even though slavery as an institution still existed. He calls a meeting amongst leadership in the freedmen community and asks them what they want. It's one of the few times in history where white men actually ask Black people what they want. And so Field Order 15 is what comes out of it, which permits 40 acres of land and a mule. Why? Because they want the freedmen who are following the Union Army as camp followers to settle and stop following them. So that is the way they do it, to say, here's some land, here's your, livestock, here's your, labor force in terms of a mule to work the land, and you can stop following us now because you're messing up our program. Now, the problem with that is that it's called Field Order 15, but it stands for a while until Johnson, who followed Lincoln, reverses it, and he's glad to do so. Johnson would be, so the first Johnson, we should say, right? Because this is the Johnson following Lincoln. The other Johnson would be the 20th century. So this is
Andrew Johnson.
Right. So he would reverse all of these things, particularly Field Order 15, or specifically Field Order 15, issued by Sherman in order to prevent camp followers following the Union Army. And we took it personally. We think that was supposed to go forward. They reversed that real quick.
Okay. So now after the agreement with Hayes, with, I guess at this time, President Hayes, what was the consequences of that to the Reconstruction ending?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing, because a lot of people don't understand what the Reconstruction amendments were even about, right? So radical Reconstruction would be reversed. Those amendments would not be reversed, but socially, those amendments that provided for citizenship and suffrage, meaning voting, those things would certainly be attacked, right? Because we can see that citizenship is certainly conditional in America for Black people, and voting was attacked by Jim Crow laws and grandfather laws. I watched something recently that said, one of the things they would say in not grandfather clause, but just these unusual requirements they would give people was, how many bubbles are in a bar of soap, or how many jelly beans are in a jar of jelly beans. Like, things people could never know. But also, too, there were some other historical things that would prevent people from voting, called the grandfather clauses. So if your grandfather voted, then you can vote. Now, for people right out of enslavement, certainly their grandfathers were not voting people. Therefore, it would easily disqualify them, right? Because they're only one, they're not even a full generation out of enslavement. We're talking about the first 12 years out of enslavement. So
how would you say that Black people responded to this compromise? I think sometimes we want to make sure that we relate the history of how we got here and how imperfect this union has been and how imperfect this democracy has been. How do we take that information and make sure we can apply it to what we see around? I think one of the things you've really shown, though, is so often in the international arena, it's almost like a self-righteous thing, as if somehow the United States democracy is without flaws and crisis. But it's clear that has been fraught with crisis, along the whole period of time that this country's been in existence. What would you say are some of the things that we can draw upon those lessons, those issues today?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that I think we can apply to today is just understanding that, one, the Reconstruction amendments that would happen shortly after the Civil War afforded not just so-called African American people freedoms, but it gave that blanket freedom to everyone, meaning a lot of people do not understand that the 14th Amendment to the Constitution is the amendment that people are still invoking today as they arrive in this country, or as first generation in this country, the right to citizenship, the possibility of citizenship. That was actually something in the Trump administration tried to reverse the 14th Amendment. It's the naturalization law. And that naturalization law just doesn't provide for citizenship, but allows for you to have equal protection under the law. So the right to go to school, to have your person protected and unthreatened, the right to all the freedoms of the Constitution, right? The right to invoke the Constitution itself, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That's what the 14th Amendment does.
What you really make a point of is that, and I know some people always bring this up in New York, the Statue of Liberty was not for immigrants per se. It was actually for the liberation of the enslaved African people in America. And when you start bringing up how these amendments were actually constituted, as it were, and why, and how it did change the lives of not just Black people, but actually all those that might come afterwards. I think the relevance of that, I think sometimes we don't understand how much we've impacted this experience and continue, as you said, currently the lives of so many people by our sacrifice and through the actions of our ancestors. I think that's very relevant as we look at, again, people talk about intersectionalism, all these things, what we've actually done to create an environment that's conducive for people's humanity. I think that's an amazing point.
Yes. It's something that I think people take for granted, in the sense that it's seldom spoken about in that way. So the 14th Amendment is very powerful. But one of the things I think is downplayed in history is that, and helps to understand this, helps to understand our present and past and future political dynamics, meaning the 13th, 14th, and the 15th Amendments to the Constitution were political strategies on the part of the Republican Party. Let's just be very clear about it. And why? There's always this vying for power in the Senate and the House, in the representation, or the realm of representation amongst American politicians and their states. What would happen in the Civil War is that all those people who were counted as 3/5 of a person, but never voting, all of those people could be counted as part of the population, which would give Southern states a numerical boom in population, forcing them to, or allowing them to have more representation in bodies like the Congress, because that's based on your population. It goes by district and numbers. And every state has 2 senators, but every state has a different number of congressmen based, or congresswomen, based on the number of people in that state. And so now all of these people, and you're talking about millions of people, no small number, because the largest portion of the African population who was enslaved in America was in the South. There was a doubling down of the population and forcing the population to explode in the South in order to have the labor to produce cotton, right? So that forced large numbers along the Black Belt in the South. When the Republicans realized that post-enslavement with the 13th Amendment, which happens relatively immediately, they do not want those numbers to be a political boom to the Southern states. They know they've got to make this a political boom to the Republicans, the Republican Party, not the Democratic Party. And so 14th and the 15th Amendment come very quickly, not quickly after the 13th, but quickly in relationship to each other. The 14th making this population citizens, and the 15th, almost like a bomb, voting, dropped that bomb on them, and voting for Black men. Now that meant that these Black men who had benefited from the Emancipation Proclamation issued by Lincoln, faithful to the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, the Freedom Party, now they would vote Republican, even though the masses of them were in the South. And so this is how the Republican Party gets a political boom. Now, listen, just like the Emancipation Proclamation was a military strategy on the part of Lincoln, the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution were a political strategy on the part of the Republican Party. It flipped.
Can we see a connection in that then, maybe in the Voters' Rights Act of the 60s, or even in the 40s, talking about New Deal with Franklin Delano Roosevelt? Do you see, again, I think it's always helpful to draw the patterns so that people can connect these bits of history to what they're facing today and how to interpret the activities of these political parties and this political system that we all live in. How would you say that some of that has manifested as we get closer to the end of this conversation so that everyone's empowered today?
Sure. There's a strategy there that's consistent, or a pattern that's consistent. The Black population in America, or the African American population in America, and I hate to say this, but very often they are pawns in the agendas of white politicians. We shouldn't ever think, let's just be very clear about something like the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation. That was Frederick Douglass in the ear of Lincoln, who said, you're either a coward or a fool not to let the 500,000 Black people fight for their freedom. Lincoln wasn't trying to do that. And so Lincoln causes a mutiny in the South of the formerly enslaved population. He frees them in the South, but look, he keeps them enslaved in the border states, which he actually controls. Over 1 million. So my point is this, that was a strategy on the part of white men, white politicians who were seeking to keep their nation unified, because everyone knows a divided nation will fall. And they did have concerns about reinvasion. So we should know that. But these are the subtexts of history. So the consistent theme is this: the African population in America, or the African American population in the United States, very often is pawns or utilized in a certain way. So a means to an end, right? Wow. A means to an end to the political ends of white Americans.
So now what you're talking about, and I think that this is very key, because so often we hear people say it's chess, not checkers, but sometimes we don't realize if it's chess, what piece on the board are you? No one plays chess to keep their pawns, and there's only one king and one queen, and you have to know who you are on that board. So I guess the point you're making in many of these dramatic historical events that we find ourselves in, unfortunately, in this country, we've been pawns in many of these situations, even to today. I mean, is that what you're really saying?
Yes, I am. But it's not to say that there's no victories on our end. And so I do want to, if we're closing, if we're coming to the end, I do want to give the high point at least, because for the African population who was enslaved in this country, this is a great victory. This is a war that never intended for its outcomes to be the freedom of the African or formerly the enslaved population. That was not the objective of the Civil War. It was to subdue the South and force them to stay in the Union. In terms of radical Reconstruction, that was never really the agenda of white Americans, to give African people who survived slavery so much power and to understand that Black men in particular would get the right to vote before white women is something very profound. But what happens with the African population who survives enslavement in this country? We are able to take our freedom in the midst of their chaos. Take it, steal it. And the victory of that is our bodies. Right? We took our bodies back from physical slavery, from physical bondage. That was never part of the plan. That's part of the reason why Lincoln makes the famous statement: if I have to free all of the slaves or none of the slaves in order to preserve the Union, that's what I'll do. In other words, slavery and the subjects of slavery are inconsequential to my agenda of unity for white men and this white nation, which is an expression of white nationalism. Let's be very real about it. I mean, so that is what the most miraculous thing is, that these people who were in 250 years of enslavement stole, took, snatched their freedom without holding a conference, without holding none of that. And there is a very specific way in which that happens. There's a series of small events that
I think that's
acts and things of that.
I think that's awesome. As we close, I think ending, and like you said, on the high note, showing that again, it was our activity, it was our engagement that has always been in our hands in order to free ourselves, and will continue to be. And I just want to thank you for definitely, as always, joining us, Dr. Wright. Thank you so much. And I want to thank you listeners, for listening to I Love Black People. I'm your co-host, Sinclair Skinner. I am because we are.